Two police officers thought they'd found the perfect target. A man in a fancy red coat who couldn't fight back. Someone they could push around in front of a crowd and walk away feeling important. They had him in handcuffs within minutes. Marched him across the forecourt like a common criminal. Made jokes about how the big man in the furry hat wasn't so tough after all. But what they didn't know was that the man they'd just arrested wasn't some ceremonial decoration. He was Sergeant Marcus Ellery, 8 years with the Coldstream Guards, 2 tours in Afghanistan, and a law degree he'd earned in his spare time between standing 12-hour vigils without moving a muscle. 15 seconds later, those same officers were standing in front of half of London, handcuffed to each other, while Ellery walked calmly back to his post. Want to see exactly how he did it? Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because what happened next just might be the most satisfying thing you see all week. The afternoon had that particular grey weight that November brings to London, when the sky sits low and heavy and makes everyone walk a little faster. A thin drizzle had passed through an hour earlier, leaving Buckingham Palace's forecourt dark and slick, every cobblestone holding a watery mirror of the Golden Gates and the Union flag tugging restlessly at its pole. Sergeant Marcus Ellery stood exactly where protocol demanded, a scarlet figure placed with mathematical precision in the ancient geometry of tradition. The tall black bearskin sat square on his head, casting a shadow over a face that had learned long ago how to become completely unreadable. His rifle rested across his chest in perfect balance, every piece of brass gleaming despite the damp air, held with the kind of steady pressure that never wavers no matter how long you've been standing. To most of the tourists clustering behind the velvet ropes, snapping photos and whispering in respectful tones, he looked like a statue, something decorative, part of the scenery. They had no idea they were looking at a man who could recite sections of public order law from memory, then stand a 12-hour guard mount without blinking. Someone who'd patrolled the streets of Kandahar and the ceremonial halls of Buckingham Palace with the same unshakable discipline. The crowd today was the usual mix. A little boy in a yellow raincoat tried to catch Ellery's eye, his small arm trembling with effort as he attempted the salute he'd clearly been practicing all morning. "Will he look at me, Dad?" he whispered hopefully. "Not supposed to, mate," his father murmured back, but he was smiling. "That's the whole point." An elderly couple nearby spoke in those hushed tones people use around ceremony. "You can't imagine the discipline it takes," the husband said, adjusting his glasses against the damp air. "Look at the shine on those boots, even after all this rain." Across the forecourt, a palace aide in a navy coat was quietly briefing 2 young stewards near the north wall. "If there are individuals who try to throw their weight around," he said carefully, choosing his words like someone who'd seen this before, "you do not engage directly. You call security. Don't get drawn into a confrontation." The stewards nodded earnestly, the way new staff do when they're not entirely sure if the warning is theoretical or based on bitter experience. A street musician's violin drifted in from somewhere on the mall, thin and slightly off-key, but earnest enough to make you listen. A bold seagull, perched on the iron railings, shook the rain from its wings and surveyed the crowd with the calculating eye of a creature that knew tourists meant dropped food. Ellery didn't watch any of this. His world had narrowed to angles and distances, to the precise weight of the rifle in his hands and the exact placement of his feet. He could taste the dampness in the air and feel the familiar ache beginning at the base of his skull where the bearskin pressed its accustomed line. His boots were positioned exactly as they'd been positioned 1,000 times before, heels together, toes flaring out 14 regulation inches. But underneath all that ceremony, underneath the perfect stillness that made tourists whisper about discipline and tradition, was something else entirely. 8 years of training that had nothing to do with standing still and everything to do with staying alive. The ability to read a room, to sense trouble before it announced itself, to know exactly when patience needed to become action. Afghanistan had taught him that stillness wasn't weakness, it was readiness. You didn't move because you couldn't. You didn't move because you were waiting for the right moment. At the coffee cart just outside the palace railings, two Metropolitan Police constables were hunched over paper cups, their conversation carrying the particular edge of men who felt the world owed them more than it was giving. PC Martin Briggs looked like someone who'd been fighting a losing battle with middle age for about 5 years now. Mid-40s, thick shoulders gone soft, his stab vest straining against a belly that spoke of too many pub lunches and not enough time on foot patrol. His cheeks were red from years of wind and weather, or maybe just from being permanently irritated with everything around him. His partner, PC Trevor Holden, was younger but carried the same air of worn-down resentment. Late 30s, boots that had seen more time under a desk than on the street, belt sitting lower than it should have. He tapped his finger against his coffee cup in that restless way of someone always looking for something to complain about. "That inspector who got the promotion last month," Briggs was saying, loud enough that his voice carried further than it needed to. 28 years old, and she's never chased anyone faster than a shopping trolley. But somehow, she's the golden girl. Holden made a disgusted sound. "Same story everywhere. It's not about doing the job anymore, is it? It's about ticking boxes, looking good in the photos." He gestured vaguely toward the palace forecourt. "Speaking of which, look at that circus." Briggs followed his gaze to where Ellery stood in perfect stillness, surrounded by the usual crowd of tourists with their phones and cameras. "Ceremonial boys," he said, with obvious disdain. "Standing around looking pretty while real police do actual work." "Bet he makes more than us too," Holden added. "All that special forces nonsense they put on their CVs. Meanwhile, we're out here dealing with actual criminals, and nobody gives us a second look." It was an old grievance, polished smooth by repetition. Neither man had ever passed a fitness test without struggling. Neither had ever made it past the promotional exams, but rather than look inward, it was easier to resent anyone who seemed to get recognition without earning it, at least without earning it the way they thought it should be earned. "Someone should remind him he puts his trousers on one leg at a time, same as everyone else," Briggs said, crushing his empty cup and missing the bin entirely. Holden's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Wouldn't be the first time we've had to bring one of these toy soldiers back down to earth." They'd done this before, found someone they thought was getting above themselves and decided to put them in their place. Usually it worked. Usually people backed down when confronted by the authority of a police uniform. What they didn't know was that Sergeant Marcus Ellery had spent 8 years learning exactly when to back down and when to stand firm. And today, they were about to find out which category they fell into. Briggs straightened his jacket like a man preparing for business. "Come on then, let's go have a word with our friend in the fancy dress." They crossed toward the forecourt with that particular swagger that some police officers develop. Slow, deliberate, making sure everyone notices the badges and the authority they represent. The tourists instinctively stepped aside, though more from politeness than intimidation. A steward near the rope line offered a respectful "Afternoon, officers," and got a curt nod in return. The younger steward beside him frowned slightly. He'd worked at the palace long enough to recognize the type. Men who expected people to move not because of who they were, but because of what they wore. Ellery's peripheral vision caught their movement. Two figures in high-vis jackets, approaching without any obvious purpose related to crowd control or security. He didn't turn his head, didn't shift his stance. His eyes remained fixed on that point in the middle distance, where all ceremonial guards learn to look, past the immediate crowd to something that exists only in training manuals and tradition. But every combat instinct he'd ever developed was suddenly awake. He could read their body language, the way they moved with too much confidence and not enough cause. The swagger that came from men who'd decided they were going to enjoy the next few minutes. Holden glanced at his partner as they closed the distance. "Look at him. Thinks he's too good to even acknowledge us." "We'll see about that," Briggs replied, his voice carrying just enough to let nearby tourists know something was about to happen. They stopped just inside the ceremonial boundary, close enough to Ellery that their presence couldn't be ignored, but far enough away to maintain the pretense that this was official business. Briggs was the first to speak, his voice pitched to carry to the crowd now gathering to watch. "Bet you've never arrested anyone in your life, have you?" Ellery didn't respond, didn't even blink. His gaze remained fixed forward, as though the two officers were shadows passing across the stones. Holden's grin widened at the silence. "Thought so. Just a decoration, aren't you? Stand there, look sharp for the tourists, let the real police do the dangerous work." A steward started forward from the rope line, his hands held in that careful, non-threatening way they'd been trained to use in delicate situations. "Officers, can I help you with—" Briggs cut him off with a lazy flash of his warrant card. "Official business, mate. Stay out of it." The steward hesitated, clearly torn between intervention and escalation. His eyes flicked toward the palace aide from earlier, who gave the slightest shake of his head. "Wait. Let this play out." Holden took a deliberate step to Ellery's right, tilting his head as if inspecting the rifle. "Nice bit of kit," he said loudly for the benefit of the watching crowd. "Bet it's never even been fired, though, just a prop for the pictures." Briggs moved closer, deliberately stepping over the ceremonial rope until his boots were almost touching Ellery's. The sound of his shoe scuffing against the wet stone was sharp in the sudden quiet. "What do you reckon he'd do if someone gave him a little nudge?" Briggs said conversationally. "Nothing, right? Stiff upper lip and all that British nonsense." A murmur ran through the crowd. Phones started coming up, some held discreetly, others raised high. A child tugged at his mother's coat. "Mummy, are they allowed to do that?" "I don't think so, sweetheart," she replied, her voice tight with uncertainty. Holden straightened and raised his voice, making sure everyone could hear. "Actually, Martin, I think we might have a problem here. Had a report earlier about a man in a red coat causing trouble. Intimidating tourists. Matches his description exactly." Briggs nodded solemnly, playing his part. "That's right. Witness said he made them feel unsafe. We take public safety very seriously." The crowd was completely quiet now, the earlier casual chatter replaced by the electric tension that builds when people sense they're about to witness something significant. Ellery's breathing remained steady, but something had shifted. Not in his posture, that remained perfect, but in the air around him, in the quality of his stillness. Like the difference between a lake on a calm day and the ocean just before a storm. The steward tried one more time, his voice firmer now. "Gentlemen, you're inside the ceremonial boundary. I must ask you to—" "We're investigating a complaint," Briggs interrupted, turning his body to block the steward's line of sight to Ellery. "Standard procedure. Can't have people thinking they're above the law." Holden's eyes glittered with satisfaction. "See, most people cooperate when we ask questions. It's just good manners." The tourists pressed closer to the rope, sensing drama. Some looked uncomfortable, others fascinated. All of them were recording now, phones held high to capture whatever was about to happen. Ellery stood exactly as he had from the moment they approached. Weight perfectly distributed, rifle held in textbook position, face unreadable beneath the bearskin. But anyone who knew how to look would have seen the subtle signs, the slight shift in his breathing, the barely perceptible adjustment of his grip, the way his peripheral vision was now tracking every movement within a 20-foot radius. This wasn't a ceremonial guard anymore. This was a soldier calculating angles and distances, reading the tactical situation, waiting for the moment when patience would need to become action. Briggs leaned closer, his voice dropping to something that sounded almost intimate. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, guard. Which is it going to be?" Ellery didn't move, didn't answer, and somehow that silence was what pushed them over the edge. Holden chuckled, the sound carrying clearly across the wet stones. "I think he's choosing the hard way." And in that moment, both officers stepped forward together, reaching for Ellery's arms with the casual confidence of men who'd never encountered real resistance before. They had no idea what they'd just set in motion. Briggs moved first, his voice cracking across the damp air like a whip. "Right, that's enough. Holden, check his weapon." Holden didn't hesitate. He reached toward the rifle sling, his fingers brushing the polished leather. Ellery shifted, barely, just enough to maintain the weapon's position, but Briggs was already shouting, "That's assault on a police officer." Several people in the crowd gasped audibly. A woman in a bright headscarf leaned forward, her voice incredulous. "What? He didn't even—" But her protest was lost in the sudden movement as both officers lunged forward. Holden grabbed Ellery's right wrist while Briggs seized the left, pulling his arms behind his back with more force than necessary. The maneuver was clumsy. Holden's own weight carried him forward as he struggled for grip on the wet stones, and his foot caught the edge of a raised cobblestone. He stumbled, nearly losing his balance entirely. But Briggs was already shouting for the crowd's benefit, "Resisting arrest! Assault on police officers!" The tourists could see perfectly well what had actually happened. The stumble had been Holden's own clumsiness, nothing more. But the two officers pressed on as if they were wrestling down a dangerous criminal. For the first time since they'd approached, Ellery spoke. His voice was calm, clear, and carried the unmistakable authority of someone who actually knew what he was talking about. "Officers, under Section 24 of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, you require reasonable grounds for arrest. You have none. I have made no aggressive movement toward you, nor have I obstructed you in the execution of your lawful duties." A ripple went through the watching crowd, murmurs of surprise and approval. An elderly man in a flat cap turned to his wife. "Bloody hell, he knows the law better than they do." Holden recovered his footing, tightening his grip on Ellery's arm as if to reassert control. "We've got grounds. You're under arrest for assault and obstruction." "Your alleged grounds," Ellery continued in that same measured tone, "are fabricated. Your conduct is in breach of the Police Code of Ethics, and you are currently in violation of the Public Order Act by disrupting a state ceremonial duty." It wasn't shouted or rushed, just stated as simple fact. And somehow that calm certainty seemed to irritate them more than any protest would have. Holden's lip curled. "You can argue all that down at the station." The cold bite of metal circled Ellery's right wrist as the handcuff ratcheted tight. He glanced briefly toward the crowd, his eyes taking in the phones, the faces, the steward who was now speaking urgently into his radio. Then he offered his left hand without further resistance. "As you wish," he said quietly. The second cuff clicked into place with deliberate force, Briggs ensuring the sound carried across the forecourt. He straightened, satisfaction clear on his flushed face. From behind the rope, a woman held her phone higher. "I'm recording this. Everyone here saw. He didn't resist at all." "Back away, miss," Briggs snapped. "Interfering with a police investigation is an offence." The steward stepped forward again, but Holden brandished his warrant card without turning around. "We're handling this. Stay out of it." They positioned themselves on either side of Ellery like prison guards escorting a dangerous criminal. The symbolism was deliberate, for the crowd as much as for him. Two representatives of law and order subduing someone who'd thought himself above accountability. What they couldn't see was the way Ellery's gaze had settled back into that middle distance, or the measured way he began matching their pace as they started toward the gates. Because for Marcus Ellery, this wasn't about the handcuffs. It wasn't about the humiliation or the crowd or the phones recording every step. This was about timing, about knowing exactly when and how to make your move. And his moment was coming very soon. The walk across the forecourt felt longer than it was. Each step echoed off the wet stones, while Briggs and Holden kept up their running commentary, ensuring everyone could see who was in charge. "Look at him now," Holden said, loud enough for the trailing crowd to hear. "Not so proud without his little rifle, is he?" Briggs squeezed Ellery's arm tighter than necessary. Should have seen his face when we put the cuffs on. Bet he's not used to being handled like that. Ellery walked between them with the same measured stride he'd maintained at his post. His hands were cuffed behind his back, but his posture remained upright, his bearing still somehow more dignified than either of his captors. The tourists followed along the rope line like spectators at a very slow parade. Some looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Others kept their phones steady, the red recording lights winking in the grey afternoon. Probably rehearsed every move for standing still, Briggs continued, playing to his audience, but nothing for when real police get involved. A couple in the crowd exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't the respectful ceremony they'd come to see. This felt wrong, though they couldn't quite articulate why. Behind the rope, the steward who'd tried to intervene earlier was walking parallel to them, his expression tight with concern. He knew better than to get directly involved, but his eyes never left Ellery's face. "You'll have a long walk back after this," Holden added, his tone sliding into something that sounded almost gleeful. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before acting like you're better than working police." From somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a man's voice carried, "He wasn't doing anything wrong. This is—" "Keep moving, sir," Briggs called back. "Nothing to see here." But there was everything to see. The contrast was stark. Two officers getting more agitated and aggressive with each step, while their prisoner remained calm, controlled, almost serene. They passed a group of German tourists who'd been photographing the palace facade. Now their cameras had swung toward the three men instead, capturing something they didn't fully understand but knew was significant. "We should get a picture of this for the station," Holden muttered to his partner. "How to deal with posh boys in fancy dress." Ellery said nothing. His breathing was steady, his eyes fixed ahead. But anyone who knew combat would have recognized what was happening. He was counting steps, measuring distances, feeling the exact pressure of the cuffs around his wrists. The locks had been applied hastily, carelessly. Standard Metropolitan Police issue, the kind he'd seen dozens of times during his law studies. The kind he could manipulate with the right pressure applied at the right angle. Each step was bringing them closer to the gates, closer to the moment when they'd be furthest from help, when the crowd would be watching most intently, when two overconfident officers would learn exactly what kind of man they'd decided to humiliate. "Not going to be so quiet when you're sitting in an interview room," Briggs said, his words carrying just far enough for everyone to hear. Ellery's head turned slightly, just enough for his voice to reach them clearly. "Actually, gentlemen," he said with perfect courtesy, "I believe our walk ends here." The gates were just ahead now, their black bars gleaming with rain. Briggs and Holden were still chuckling at their own jokes, still revelling in their moment of authority. They had no idea that in the next 15 seconds everything was about to change. The handcuffs had been loose from the start, applied too quickly, locked carelessly by men more interested in the theatre than the technique. Ellery had worked them looser still during the walk, tiny adjustments masked by the natural swing of his arms. By the time Holden leaned in to deliver his final insult, "Let's see how tough you are without your audience," the cuffs were barely touching Ellery's wrists. "I think," Ellery said conversationally, "this is where we part ways." His hands slipped free in one smooth motion. Before either officer could react, he'd grabbed the loose cuffs and spun them in a precise arc that caught both men's wrists as they still gripped his arms. The first click was sharp as a gunshot in the quiet air. The second followed immediately after. Briggs and Holden found themselves handcuffed together, palm to palm, the chain linking them tight. They stared down at their joined hands in complete bewilderment. "What the hell?" Holden began, then jerked against the restraints. The movement only pulled Briggs off balance, making them both stumble. Ellery's hand moved to Briggs's belt, retrieving the small silver key with the casual efficiency of someone performing a routine task. He held it up briefly, letting it catch the light, then slipped it into the pocket beneath his scarlet tunic. The crowd caught on instantly. A gasp ran along the rope line, followed by laughter that started sharp with surprise and built into something rich with appreciation. Phones tilted upward, capturing Ellery in perfect frame as he stepped back from the two bewildered officers. He gave a single courteous nod toward the nearest steward. "These gentlemen may require assistance," he said in the same polite tone he might use to comment on the weather. Then, without so much as a backward glance, he turned and walked toward his post. The laughter followed him across the forecourt, rolling over the wet stones like applause. By the time he'd covered the 20 yards back to his position and resumed his stance, rifle held in perfect balance, eyes fixed forward, expression unreadable beneath the bearskin, the sound was still echoing off the palace walls. Behind him, 2 Metropolitan Police constables stood in the centre of the ceremonial ground, handcuffed together, while half of London watched and recorded every moment of their humiliation. At first, Briggs and Holden just stood there, staring at their bound wrists like the sight might somehow undo itself. Then came the tugging, hesitant at first, then increasingly frantic, as each tried to break free without giving the other the satisfaction of admitting they were trapped. "Get these bloody things off me," Holden hissed, yanking his arm hard enough to make Briggs stumble. "They're your cuffs," Briggs shot back. "You figure it out." That earned them another wave of laughter from the crowd. Someone shouted, "Say cheese!" and the sound of camera shutters filled the air. A steward approached cautiously, his professional composure cracking slightly around the edges. "Officers, do you require any assistance?" Briggs's face had gone an alarming shade of red that had nothing to do with the November chill. "We're fine. It's just a temporary situation." "Temporary?" Holden muttered. "He's got the bloody key." The elderly man in the flat cap spoke up from behind the rope. "Seems to me he let you get close enough to teach you both a lesson." The crowd murmured agreement. Parents were leaning down to explain to their children what they'd just witnessed, framing it as a story about respect and consequences. A boy, clutching a small Union Jack, pointed excitedly toward Ellery's post. "Look, Mum, he's back exactly where he was, like nothing even happened." And indeed, Sergeant Marcus Ellery stood in perfect position, his bearing unchanged, his rifle held with that same unwavering precision. To a casual observer, he might never have moved at all. "Right," Holden said through gritted teeth. "Just march over there and get the key back." "I'm not walking across that forecourt," Briggs replied firmly. "Half the internet's watching by now." The steward cleared his throat delicately. "Perhaps I could retrieve it for you." Both officers shook their heads in unison, their pride refusing the offered lifeline, even as their situation grew more ridiculous by the minute. From the rope line, a woman with a bright red scarf called out, "Maybe if you ask nicely." The laughter that followed was warmer now, less sharp. What the crowd had witnessed was settling into understanding, a perfect demonstration of what happened when bullying met discipline, when assumed authority encountered earned respect. Someone in the back shouted, "Best arrest I've ever seen," and the applause that followed was genuine. As the palace clock chimed the quarter hour, Ellery shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, settling back into the complete stillness of his post. The episode was over, the point made with surgical precision. For him, there was nothing more to do. The dignity had been restored, the lesson had been taught, and the duty, as always, remained. The two officers could work out their own problems. They'd created the situation through their arrogance and incompetence. Let them solve it the same way. Behind him, the crowd was already beginning to disperse, people talking in excited whispers about what they'd witnessed. The phones were still out, the videos already uploading, the story spreading through social media at the speed of modern outrage. But none of that mattered to the man in the scarlet tunic. He had a post to hold, a tradition to maintain, and a duty that transcended the petty politics of embarrassed police officers. The rest, as they say, was just noise. So tell me, do you think Sergeant Ellery was right to turn the tables on those officers? Should he have let them drag him off to face whatever trumped-up charges they'd invented? Or was a little public humiliation exactly what they deserved? Have you ever seen someone shut down a bully that perfectly? That completely? Without violence, without drama, just with pure skill and perfect timing. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely read every single one, and these conversations matter more than you might think. If this story showed you something about what real strength looks like, if it reminded you that the best response to ignorance is often quiet competence, hit that like button. It actually helps more than you know. Subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our daily stories about the remarkable people behind these ancient traditions. The men and women who serve without seeking glory, who maintain dignity under pressure, who know exactly when to stand still and when to move. And if you know someone who still thinks the Royal Guards are just for decoration, share this with them. Let them see for themselves what happens when ceremony meets real-world competence. Your next story is waiting right here on your screen. Click it now, and I'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over again. Real authority doesn't need to announce itself. It just stands ready until the moment comes to act. And when it does move, the whole world stops to watch.